Listen carefully. The real population of China is only 300 million people. Yeah. You heard that right. 300 million. No more than that. Forget the official 1.4 billion figure. You've been lied to. And everything above that number is just propaganda Beijing made up. That's what dozens of YouTube videos will tell you. The other claim is even more astonishing. 400 million Chinese died during COVID, and the rest of the world somehow missed it. By the way, 400 million, that's more than everyone living in the United States. You can't lose that many people and have nobody notice. No country is good enough at lying to pull that off. So let me be blunt with you. Whoever make this video stumble into something real and then drown it in complete nonsense. The awkward part is that the footage they show are not fake. The streets in a lot of Chinese cities are emptier than they were 10 years ago, which is exactly why the wild version sells so well. It feels like proof, but it isn't. The honest explanation is less cinematic and a lot more troubling. China is losing people, just not the way the clickbait swears it is. And the most alarming numbers about it aren't hidden on the dark web or leaked by some anonymous insider. Beijing published them itself this January. They're worse than the officials want to admit, and they point to something every one of these scandal channels completely overlooked. So forget the missing million, billion. The thing China is actually trying to hide turns out to be a far bigger problem than a quiet shopping street. That's what I'm going to show you in this video. I've been doing business in Asia for 26 years. That's the whole reason this channel exists, to explain what's really happening in this part of the world from the inside. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. This past January, Beijing's own statistics bureau reported that the population had dropped by 3.39 million in a single year, down to just over 1.4 billion. It's the fourth year running that it has shrunk. The figure that should stop you, though, is about the babies. 7.92 million children were born in 2025, the lowest number since the country began counting in 1949, down 17% from the year before. A country that spent decades terrified of having too many people just watch his newborn fall by nearly a fifth in 12 months. So, where does the real population is 300 million come from? Nowhere serious. Now, to be fair, China's statistical system has been criticized before. That's exactly why serious demographers don't blindly accept Beijing's numbers. They compare birth registrations, school enrollments, census data, and local records. The debate is about tens of millions, not a missing billion. The most aggressive number any credible demographer has ever put on the table belongs to Yi Fuxian at the University of Wisconsin. He has spent years arguing that China overcounts itself and lands at roughly 1.28 billion, maybe 100 to 130 million below the official line. That's a serious argument, and plenty of his colleagues think even that goes too far. The empty streets that kicked all of this off are real, and the explanation behind them is dull. Fewer young people are being born. The ones who do exist pile into a handful of big coastal cities chasing work. I've personally watched second and third tier city change over the last 2 decades. Some districts that felt crowded in the 2000s felt way quieter today. But quieter isn't the same thing as empty. The economy has slowed hard since COVID, and a great deal of the shopping that once filled those streets now happens on the phone. Those changes are enough to empty out a shopping district in some third-tier city, and none of them needs a hidden massacre to make sense. And this is the part every scandal channel ignored while they were hunting for bodies. The real emergency is in the maternity ward. And none of this happened to China by accident. China did it to itself on purpose starting more than 40 years ago. In the 1950s and 60s, Mao wanted China full. A bigger population meant more workers, more soldiers, more proof that the revolution was winning. For a while, families had 5 or 6 kids each, and the government cheered them on. Then the famines and the chaos of those same decades killed tens of millions, and the men running China were left with a new conviction. Now there were too many mouths, and the population was the problem to be solved. They started gently, with a campaign in the 70s that told people to marry later, wait longer between children, and stop sooner. It worked, and the birth rate fell, but not fast enough for a leadership that has decided population growth was an emergency. So, in 1980, they reached for the bluntest instrument any modern state has ever used on its own people. 1 child per family, enforced not with posters and polite suggestions, but with mass sterilization campaigns, mandatory IUDs, and forced abortions. A whole generation grew up as only children in a country where the small family stopped being a sacrifice and started being normal. But here's the trap. To keep a population stable over the long run, the average woman has to have about 2.1 children, 1 to replace each parent, with a little little margin for the ones who don't make it. China fell below that line in the early 90s and has stayed under it for more than 30 years straight. By the time the policy's own architects realized the problems, an entire society had rebuilt its ideas of a normal life around having one child or none. And that turns out to be almost impossible to reverse, which brings us to the moment it became too late. In 2016, after 36 years, Beijing finally scrapped the one-child policy, then went further and told families they can have as many kids as they like. By the time the government decided it needed more children, the Chinese had already learned to live without them. Apartments in big cities cost a fortune, raising a child costs a fortune more, and a single grown-up now often carries 2 parents and 4 grandparents on their shoulders with no siblings to share the weight. You cannot order a population to want what 40 years of policy taught it not to want. They tried, and the birth numbers barely twitch. A country that simply has fewer people can manage that. But what China is facing is the harder version of the story. This channel covers what's actually happening in Asia from someone who has been on the ground for 26 years, not from an office in London or Paris. If that sounds interesting to you, subscribe. The same policy that stopped China filling its cradles also froze a giant generation in place, and that generation is now getting old all at once. More than 323 billion people in China, around 23% of the population are already over 60. The line of workers coming up behind them to support all these retirements gets thinner every year. The working age population is now shrinking by more than 6 million people a year, which is roughly a city the size of Singapore, leaving the workforce every 12 months and not being replaced. This matters because of how China got rich in the first place. The whole model resting on an enormous supply of young workers who will take a factory job for wages the rest of the world couldn't compete with. The supply is the exact thing now drying up. As the young get scarcer, they get more expensive, which is the unglamorous reason a Chinese factory costs a lot more to run today than it did 15 years ago. The cheap labor that built the world's workshop is aging into retirement, and there aren't enough kids behind it to take its place. The cruel timing is that this is happening before China ever finished getting wealthy. And I can hear the objection already. China is the second biggest economy on the planet, so how can it not be rich? The catch is, the biggest economy and the rich country are two different things. In 2024, China's GDP per capita was around $13,000, or about 1/6 of the United States level, which places it in a similar income range to Mexico. Beijing still describes China as a developing country. Japan and South Korea grew old too, but they grew old as rich societies with the savings and the pensions and the hospitals already paid for. China is trying to do the same thing on a middle-income paycheck with a safety net that was never built for this many retirees. The pension math is already breaking down in places. Several Chinese provinces are running large deficits in their pension funds, paying out to a swelling crowd of old people with contributions from a shrinking crowd of young ones. And the gap only widens from here. None to mention the part that reaches well beyond China's border. A country's power in the world has often rested on the simple weight of numbers. The size of its workforce, the size of its army, the size of the market everyone else wants to sell into. All three of those are now pointing in the same direction, and it's not how. The men running China can read those numbers better than anyone, and they have spent the last few years throwing everything they have at the problem. The trouble is that almost none of it is working. The first instinct was the obvious one. If people want to have babies, pay them to. Provinces tried it for years, and then in 2025, Beijing went national with the biggest version yet, 3,600 yuan a year for every child under 3. The government itself called it the first direct cash payment to all citizens since the People's Republic was founded in 1949. That sounds historic until you do the conversion. It comes to roughly $500 a year against a bill of raising a child in a Chinese city that runs to the tens of thousands. You're handing someone a coupon and asking them to sign for the most expensive 20-year commitment of their life. Korea spent over $200 billion on payments like this and watched its birth rate fall to the lowest on earth anyway. Money was never really the thing standing between young Chinese couples and a second child. So Beijing reached for the other levers too. In 2025, it made it easier to get married by letting couples register anywhere in the country instead of in their hometown. For the government, marriage is the thing that comes just before babies in the official sequence. On the other end of the life, they started raising the retirement age, lifting it for men from 60 to 63 over the next 15 years. That's the polite way of explaining to people that they will have to work longer to carry everyone else. But the most telling bet is the one that gives up on actual people. If you can't make new workers, you build them. China now installs more than half of all the industrial robots sold on the planet in a single year, and its factories already run over 2 million of them. It's more than any other country on Earth. The country that conquered global manufacturing with cheap human hands is now replacing those hands with machines, racing to automate faster, and its workforce disappears. I see this from a particular set. At Statrys, we help entrepreneurs set up and run their businesses across Asia, which means I spend my days talking to the people actually doing this. It's an interesting answer to the labor shortage, but it does nothing whatsoever for the deeper problem. A robot assembles a car door, but it doesn't grow up, pay taxes for 40 years, or buy an apartment. And then there's the move almost nobody expected from China. Even in a subject that stayed taboo for decades, Beijing has started to bend. Last year, it created a brand new visa aimed at pulling in young foreign scientists and engineers. No Chinese employer required, the kind of open-door talent scheme the country has spent its whole modern history refusing to need. That's a confession. None of these levers reverse the line on the chart. The cash isn't enough, the marriage reform nudges a number that's already collapsing, and later retirement only helps make a shrinking workforce last longer. And the robots and the foreign engineers patch the symptoms while the cradle stays empty. Every one of these solutions buys a little time, none of them buys a single extra child. For 40 years, people were the engine under the world Chinese miracle. The question now isn't whether Beijing is hiding a missing billion, because obviously it isn't. The question is what a country becomes when the one thing it was built on starts to run out, and nobody has actually answered that yet. China isn't even alone in this. South Korea's birth rate is lower. Japan has been aging for so long, it sells more adult diapers than baby ones. Italy and Germany are shrinking too. What makes China different is the speed and the scale. The fact that an entire civilization of 1.4 billion people is turning into decline in the span of a single generation while it's still trying to get rich. The rest of the engine world is watching closely, because China is about to run the experiment first, in public, with nowhere to look up the answer. So, the empty street in that viral video was telling you something true. Just not the thing the caption claimed. There's no missing population because of COVID or something else. There's something slower and, in its own way, heavier. A country that decided decades ago exactly how many children he wanted, got precisely what he asked for, and is now finding out what that cost. If you spend time in China, drop what you saw in the comments. Which city, which year, what changed? I really want to know your opinion on this. Subscribe if you haven't done it yet. See you in the next video.